The time that had passed from Genesis 3:15 until the time that Abraham appears on the scene. I mean, talk about a long time, and the generations that may be anticipating this promised seed.
He's 75 when God actually tells him to leave the land that he's in. So there we see time pass. This isn't just a few months. This is over 20 years before Isaac is promised to him. There is something to be said about the waiting period and what happens during that time.
It's God's faithfulness is highlighted.
But also the question that Abraham, I would think, would have logically had is, okay, you've promised me this. I'm getting pretty old here.
Yeah.
Is this going to become a reality? And how is it going to become a reality?
Welcome to this episode of Zion's Wire, the official podcast of Zion's Hope, where we bring you biblical insight and prophetic discussions with a passion for God, His people, and His plan for planet Earth. I'm Christopher Diaz, and I'm joined today by the president of Zion's Hope, David Rosenthal.
Great to be here.
Yes, and our Bible teacher, Bob Hunt.
Thank you.
Yes. So this week we're going to be jumping into Abraham continuing with the promised seed through his son Isaac. And last week we touched on the Abrahamic covenant and the promised land, but we're jumping back. So Genesis 3, we see the introduction of the seed, and then it brings us to a question of how is God narrowing the path through which he's bringing the seed? So I'm going to just dump that right there and let you take it.
Sure. Well, it's so foundational to go back to Genesis 3 and the fall of humanity, and mankind has a what seems like an insurmountable problem after the fall is that we, if left in our condition through Adam and Eve and their sin in the garden, we are eternally separated from God if nothing changes, if God doesn't intervene. And so the wonder of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 is the promise of a seed that will come to essentially bring redemption to humanity, to restore mankind's lost destiny as king of the earth. That's what God created Adam and Eve to do and to be in the garden. And so in Genesis 3:15, we have the promise of a seed that would come that would defeat Satan and to bruise or to crush his head. And so the question that we have that's logical is, okay, well then if there's a seed that's coming, where is that seed coming from? And we continue on in Genesis chapter 12, God calls a man by the name of Abram from Ur of the Chaldees, which is modern day Iraq. And he says, I'm going to get you to a land that I'm going to tell you to go to. And again, by faith, Abraham, and we're going to talk a lot about faith in this episode. By faith, Abram at that time, goes to the land of Canaan. And he uproots his whole life in following what God tells him to do. And he goes to the land of Canaan, and there's a promise there that God says, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to give you this land. And moving on into Genesis chapter 13, God brings Abraham to Bethel. He brings him to a high point in the land. We talked about in a past episode that he says, Abraham, I want you to look north, south, east, and west. In every direction, everywhere your eye sees, that's the land that I'm giving you and to your posterity. And then we get to Genesis 15, and we spend some time here in Genesis chapter 15 in terms of the covenant. Abraham says, well, how am I going to know, God, that you're giving me this land and to my posterity? And God says, I'm going to show you. And he cuts a covenant. We talked about the severing of animals.
Yeah, right.
And there's that severing of the animals, and God himself walks between those animals. And the idea is, may what happened to these animals happen to me if I don't keep the covenant promise that I made. So covenants were cut in blood in historic times, And they were very serious things, not just like on a piece of paper. They were cut in blood, and by God requiring Abraham to sever these animal parts, it was a bloody mess. And God himself, after he puts Abraham into a deep sleep, God himself goes through the parts. And what that indicates to us is the clarity that which God is saying, I am making a covenant, and it is unilateral. In other words, Abraham was put into a sleep, and he didn't walk through the animal parts. It was God himself that went through those parts. So it was unilateral, one party. Usually covenants were, two parties
Right.
coming together in agreement. In this case, God is doing it, and it's unilateral, and God makes it unconditional. There's no conditions upon which Abraham was going to realize the promise of this land and this covenant of this land that would be given to Abraham and his posterity as an everlasting inheritance. And it is eternal. We know that covenant, and you brought that out, that this is an eternal covenant that God made, and it's clear over and over as an everlasting covenant, the text tells us. So then we get over to Genesis chapter 17, and why don't you take it from there, Bob, in terms of the child that is promised, and Abraham and Sarah are old in age.
One thing I want to kind of back up just a little bit
Sure.
is the time that had passed from Genesis 3:15 until the time that Abraham appears on the scene. I mean, talk about a long time, and the generations that may be anticipating this promised seed. And often we gripe about how long it takes for God to answer our prayers and act, and we see it here, but God does answer that prayer. And I also want to kind of emphasize the fact that how important Abraham's faith plays into not only the life of Abraham and the promised seed, but when we get into 22 with the actual sacrifice of Isaac and Abraham there in Mount Moriah, how his faith is tested. And even that was not immediate, because when we looked at chapter 15 in verse 6, and if you don't mind, I'll read it to you. It says that Abraham, after God said, look at the stars, your descendants will be as all of the stars, in other words, innumerable. And it says, very simple statement, he believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. I don't want to elaborate too much, but most commentators look at this and see this is the point, that Abram at this time believed in the Lord, and thus, in our own vernacular, saved, and became, God's chosen at that level. And some commentators say this is the most important verse in the Bible. 3 times in the New Testament it gets expounded, and it's directly connected to our salvation. The reason I bring that up is because this is going to become important. He gets saved in chapter 15, but then we'll see he's going to get tested strongly in chapter 22. I think most of us as Christians can relate to that in a big way. Mm-hmm. And Abraham, as the father, experienced the same thing.
You touched on the time gap there from Genesis 3 to the time that Abraham even comes on the scene, and we see this gap. And even in chapter 12, to what we are going to get to in just a moment, he's 75 when God actually tells him to leave the land that he's in. So there we see time pass. This isn't just a few months. This is over 20 years before Isaac is promised to him. Wow. So I started to think about our own lives, and sometimes we pray and we're expecting something to happen right away, but there is something to be said about the waiting period and what happens during that time.
It's God's faithfulness is highlighted.
But also the question that Abraham, I would think, would have logically had is, okay, you've promised me this. I'm getting pretty old here.
Yeah.
Is this going to become a reality? And how is it going to become a reality? And so in our humanness, it's, I think, pretty easy to see how Abraham may have wanted to take matters into his own hands.
He did.
Yeah.
He did.
Yeah.
And how we can understand why that would have happened. He's getting to be an old man, and he says, okay, I believe God. I trust in what he's telling me, but in my human understanding, how is that going to be possible as I'm getting up in age and my wife is getting up in age?
It's interesting, chapter 16, which comes after his faith experience with God. You have the whole incident of Sarah giving Hagar to Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a perfect example of what you were saying, is humanness. And oftentimes in our lives, human wisdom usually ends up in human failure.
Mm-hmm.
And it did big time in chapter 16. I mean, we're still paying the price.
Yeah.
For that decision of Abraham. I mean, Ishmael was the father of a nation, it says, and he had 12 sons who most believe populated the Arab world, which now, becomes an issue in the Middle East today. And so that
the nemesis of Israel.
Yeah, the enmity spoken of in chapter 3 is laying a foundation there in chapter 16. And so some decisions we make just not only affect us, and it did affect Abraham and Sarah, but it also affects many other people around us. And this was one that would be a generational to the end.
The events of these chapters are pivotal for all of humanity through all of human history.
Yeah.
You have an act of flesh in Abraham's decision to rush, and then an act of promise with the bringing forth of Isaac. So then God. So that brings us then to Isaac's birth and what we're getting into now.
Right.
So we see this thread start to weave through. We mentioned in a previous episode where God's giving this covenant, and Abraham says, well, what about Ishmael? He says, like you said, Bob, all right, I'm going to bless him, but no, my promise, my covenant will be through Isaac.
Yeah, Abraham's logical thinking is, well, then if you're promising me all these things, then it's going to be through Ishmael. And God says, no, it's not going to be through Ishmael. I'm going to bless Ishmael too, and he's going to be fruitful, and he's going to have, nations will spring forth from him too. But God says, but my covenant will be through Isaac. And God makes it very, very clear that it is through Isaac that the covenant that God establishes with Abraham and his posterity is through Isaac, not Ishmael. And that's critical in Genesis chapter 17. And then, go ahead, Bob.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, then we get to Genesis 22. And we really want to spend some time here in Genesis 22. What an amazing chapter this is. And so after all of this time and everything that Abraham had gone through with Sarah and the birth of Isaac and the clarity of that the covenant was going through Isaac, Genesis 22 starts out, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt. And in the King James or some translations, it says tempt Abraham. And the better, I think, translation here is testing him. And you had mentioned this before, that in the life of every believer, there are testings and trials and difficulties. And we should all expect those things in the life of the believer. But here, Abraham is being tested by God. And verse 2, he says, and he said, take now thy son, God says to Abraham, thine only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest. And I love the phrasing there. He says, take now thy son, singular,
right?
Thine only son. If there was any question that we're talking about thine only son and the name Isaac, whom thou lovest. So not only was God saying to Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, if there's any question, we're talking about Isaac here, and God goes beyond and he says, whom I know you love. I know there's an emotional component here. We can easily kind of read it informationally and lose sight of the emotional aspect of what this would have meant to Abraham to be told to take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. And the verse continues, and get thee into the land of Moriah and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. So Moriah, for those who've been to Israel or who study Israel, the area of the Temple Mount today is called Mount Moriah, or is known as Mount Moriah. But Moriah, really, according to Scripture, wasn't a singular mountain. It was more of a mountainous region or a range, you could say, of mountains. But this is the area where God told Abraham to take Isaac. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, verse 3, and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him. I'm astounded. Abraham rose up early in the morning. After hearing God say to Abraham, I want you to take your son, I want you to offer him up as a sacrifice.
Yeah.
I think I heard my dad say many times when he was teaching on this, he'd say, that's one morning I would have slept in.
Right.
The idea of getting up early in the morning, knowing that you were facing this incredible test that God had put before you and command to take your son and to offer him a sacrifice. But Abraham gets up early and he takes Isaac and the wood for the burnt offering, and he went to the place that God had told him. And then verse 4, then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And I don't think it's insignificant that it was on the 3rd day. In Scripture, when we read of the 3rd day, it's connected to resurrection.
Right.
And I think it's not by mistake that here in this text, on the 3rd day, which speaks of resurrection, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And verse 5, Abraham said unto his young men, abide ye here with the ass, and listen, I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. And it's easy again to just gloss over this, but in the text, what I think is really there in the original is I and the lad, Abraham says to his 2 young servants, I and the lad will go yonder and worship. And the clear inference here is, and I and the lad will come back unto you. We will go together and both of us will return. And I think that what we see here in this text, and we'll see it even further, is the idea within Abraham that there is the necessity, if God is going to be true to the covenant promise that he made with Abraham,
Mm-hmm.
that Abraham would give birth to a seed, and through that seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed, that there is a concept within the heart and mind of Abraham that God, to be true to that covenant, would have to raise Isaac from the dead. And I think it's significant that it says on the 3rd day he arrives, and he says to the servants, I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and the clear inference is, and I and the lad will come again unto you. The idea that we're coming back, but yet God's directive was to take your son and to sacrifice him. So if he and the lad were going to go and come back, Abraham had to have the understanding that God, to be faithful to his covenant promise, would have to raise him from the dead.
And even just past that, as his son is carrying the wood, he's helping set up the fire, and he asked the question, where's the lamb? And Abraham's response, even then, God will provide for himself the lamb.
Yeah.
And Bob, I know you had some deep thoughts here on faith in this moment, because, we're all dads. I can't imagine for a moment being in Abraham's position and looking at my son and hearing from God, okay, here's the test. I can't imagine that, but this is a huge step of faith.
Yeah, this is all about faith. This is faith and trust. You trusting God to be one of his word. And I believe Abraham did. Back in 15, he believed in the Lord, and now it's a step of obedience. So we often see that faith is often proven by your future obedience. And I think I've mentioned before that your faith is played out by your actions and your works, and that's what's happening to Abraham. He's already faithful. He's already a man of faith, and now God is testing him by actions. It's like someone has said, a faith that's untested really is no faith at all.
Right.
Which is an interesting concept, and that's what's happening here. More to prove Abraham to himself his faith than really anything else. And so it really is all about faith. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to look at Hebrews 11.
Let's get there, but in that it's a beautiful picture here in verse 8. I don't want to miss this. And Abraham said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. And so they went, both of them together. And that's so important, what that verse is saying, because when they went, both of them together, it means they went in agreement.
Yeah.
They went in agreement. So when Isaac says, I see the fire in the wood, but where's the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will provide himself a lamb. I love that play on words. God will provide himself a lamb. And of course, we have the benefit of looking back and understanding, being on this side of the cross, to see the beautiful picture. And that's what Genesis 22 is. It's a beautiful picture of God the Father and God the Son, Jesus Christ. And in the person of Abraham as God the Father and Isaac as Jesus Christ, the sacrifice who was given. And it's not insignificant that here in this text, which is a beautiful foreshadowing, a beautiful picture of what many years later would happen with God the Father and God the Son at Calvary, to say that Isaac understood that God would provide that sacrifice, and they went in agreement together. You know, when Jesus Christ came, he came willingly at the behest of the Father to earth to give himself a ransom for many. They were in agreement. And so the beauty of this is the play on words. Abraham says, my son, God will provide himself. Not only does he provide it, he is it through the person of his son, Jesus Christ,
Right.
so many years later. So what a beautiful verse, and so much is wrapped up, and both of them went together in agreement. In verse 9, they came
Can I pause?
Yes, absolutely.
Yep. Since we're on verse 8, I had mentioned to Chris previously, I looked at some of the Jewish texts on this verse here to see how they were handling it. And I want to just tell you how it's written. Now, the same words are there, but the inference may be a little different. It says, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And that's how the text reads, no comma.
Mm-hmm.
And I was listening to a Jewish rabbi, said there's no comma in the Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he went in a different direction, but let me say, was he not telling him right there that the offering was going to be my son? And also a foreshadowing, of presenting of Jesus Christ. And
Yeah.
and also don't miss Isaac's obedience in all of this. I mean, he's trusting his father, he's putting his faith in God. He's not a baby, he's not even a little child. The word in Hebrew is na'ar, and it just means a young man. And most people think 25 to 30 is a reasonable guess.
Mm-hmm.
He could have easily have walked away and said no.
Especially thinking in terms of how old Abraham was at the time.
Sure,
I mean,
right.
he could have pushed Abraham over and ran off.
Yeah.
He says, I'm not doing this.
Yeah.
But he
Yeah.
didn't. He was willing in obedience.
So there's two of them here,
Yeah.
trusting and walking together, as it says in the Lord. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. And they came, in verse 9, to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son. And again, we get to the issue of, here's a 100-year-old man who's just walked how many days' journey, right? And he is binding Isaac. So clearly Isaac is willing and is understanding what's taking place here. And he's of an age where he very easily could have pushed his father over and run off. But Abraham binds Isaac, lays him on the altar and upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And incidentally, I've seen pictures or depictions or artist renderings of this, and you always see, usually you see a knife almost like in a stabbing action, but
Right.
likely it wouldn't have been like that, because when an animal was sacrificed, normally the neck was slit, so it would have been a slit across the neck to cut off the blood flow there. So it wouldn't have been just a stabbing action, likely. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, took the knife to slay his son, and the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. Wow, talk about last minute wonder of hearing that voice from heaven, probably hoping that he's going to hear something from
Right.
God
Yeah.
as he's approaching this momentous moment that, as you mentioned, all of us as fathers, to how do we even consider something of this nature? And here is Abraham in great faith and Isaac in obedience. It's an amazing picture.
Yeah, and we see, as you said in verse 11, and the angel of the Lord. And in the version I have in my Bible, that's caps.
Mhm.
And so if that isn't a fact, then who is the angel of the Lord?
Yeah.
That would be Christ himself
Mhm.
interceding between Abraham. That's just too much. We could just
Mhm.
go on and
Yeah.
develop that all together.
And Abraham says, "Here am I." And he said, "Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son," here it is again, "thine only son from me." Verse 13, "And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen." And again, I would suggest to you that there's more here than in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. The idea is in the mount of the Lord, in this very place, the ultimate sacrifice for humanity, will be provided in this location. It will take place here. And verse 15, "And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time and said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee." And we'll continue in a minute. I want to go back to verse 16. "By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord." And it's kind of an unusual phrase in today's vernacular, but "by myself have I sworn," in historic times when you would swear on something, and even today, you'd say, "I swear on something greater than myself." So you'd say, "Oh, I swear," someone would say, "I swear on the Bible," or
Right.
someone's grave, or something that is bigger and more significant than oneself. And here you have the angel of the Lord, God, saying, "By myself have I sworn." Why by
greater,
myself?
right?
There is nothing greater. There is no one greater. So "by myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing," Abraham exhibited faith, "and has not withheld thy son, in blessing I will bless thee, life and goodness, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies." And here we come to verse 18, and we're going to conclude here, I think. "And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice." And what a beautiful picture. In thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Of course, we understand that the covenant promise was through Abraham, started with Abraham, through Isaac, Isaac's descendant Jacob, and then the 12 tribes. And that seed, we know the scepter will not depart from the tribe of Judah. And ultimately, Jesus Christ is born, and he is that promised seed going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15.
Paul in Galatians 3:16 identifies Jesus as the seed that was promised.
Yeah. So this chapter is so pivotal in the understanding of Abraham as the patriarch of the faithful. And he is a man of great faith. Let's go to Hebrews 11 just for a moment, because I don't think you can talk about Genesis 22 without at least touching on Hebrews chapter 11. This is known as the faith chapter, and so many men and women of faith through the Bible are discussed here, and they're great evidence of faith and the different things that came into their lives and how they triumphed over them through great faith in God. And I love verse 17.
Yeah.
"By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son." That language is so familiar in terms of his only begotten son. We think of Jesus Christ in those terms as well. Verse 18, "Of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called." So once again, clarity now in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, that in Isaac it was the seed. But I love verse 19. Accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. So the text is so clear. And I've heard people say, when I've said before, that Abraham's faith was so strong that when he was taking Isaac to offer him as a sacrifice, that for God to be true to those covenant promises, Abraham believed with every fiber of his being that if God was going to be true to those promises, he had to raise Isaac from the dead. And I've heard people say, "Oh, don't you think, Dave, that's taking it a little too far? Don't you think that maybe you're reading a little bit too much into the text?" And then we go to Hebrews 11.
Right,
it's right there. And the first time I saw that, I had tears in my eyes, because it just shows the great faith of Abraham, that he believed that God to be true to what he had promised, and that covenant promise and that seed that would come would have to raise his son from the dead. And what a magnificent picture of faith for us, all of us today.
Yeah, God is faithful to fulfill his promises, even if it takes generations for us to see it come to pass. He's faithful, regardless.
Yeah.
Even with the children of Israel, they were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, and God says, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people, and I have come to rescue them." And after 400 years, right, they're enslaved, and he says, "Nope, I haven't forgotten my covenant promise through the covenant people. I'm coming to redeem them and bring them out of enslavement." So time is not an issue for God. He is faithful yesterday, today, and forever. And Abraham was a wonderful example of the type of faith that we can only hope to aspire to have when it comes to our relationship with God.
That's good.
Yeah, we have a special heart for the Jewish people here at Zion's Hope. And so I always wonder, it's such a pivotal chapter, what does the Jewish person do with this? And I spent some time looking at that, because how do they handle it? First they say they're confused, because it is hard. You alluded to that. It is very difficult. And there's a lot of reasons we won't go into why this may or may not have fit into the culture. But the Jewish people actually have a reading from the Torah on either Rosh Hashanah or the day after. And it's chapter 22 of Genesis. Well, that's the new year. Why would they have it at the new year? It's called the Akedah altar, the binding of Isaac. And so the focus is more on Isaac than Abraham. But the interesting thing that I thought was see this as a message of hope as they recite chapter 22, a hope of for the Lord to remember our lives as they get into the future years. And I thought, boy, that's pretty cool. What an opportunity here to tell them, the future life that you have is more than just a year down the road, but it's eternal. And this picture here gives an opportunity. It foreshadows the one who will bring that eternal life. So for the Jewish person, they read 22 at the beginning of the year because it's a picture of life, and how true that is, but spiritually even more.
And it's such a beautiful picture for our Jewish brethren to grasp hold of. It's not just an Old Testament story of someone who is so revered in Abraham and Isaac as well, but it is as we mentioned before, it is a beautiful picture that God has given to us, where God spared Abraham the horror of having to sacrifice his son, but yet so many years later, God, who loved us and who loved the world and didn't want us to see us dying in our sin and eternally separated from him, he didn't spare himself that agony of sacrificing his own son on the cross of Calvary. He went through with that. And Jesus, just as Isaac was obedient and faithful and in agreement with his father, Jesus went to the cross as our promised Messiah to bring redemption to all of humanity through his death, his sacrificial death, his burial, and his resurrection.
Yeah. So God's promise then is narrow in the sense that it was clearly through a specific seed, but it was also broad, in that he was blessing all the nations, he said. All nations we will bless. I think that's a great place to end.
Yeah.
Right? For our listeners, hope you've enjoyed this episode. Like, share, comment, give us some questions, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks for joining us today on this episode of Zion's Wire, a podcast fueled by a passion for God, His people, and His plan for planet Earth. If you were encouraged by today's episode, share it with a friend and subscribe so you never miss a moment. Keep the conversation going with questions or comments, and until next time, keep watching, keep praying, and keep your heart fixed on God's Word.